In New York, this is Democracy Now!
It's important to remember that this has been a 60-year battle to make voting more accessible, more available to Americans across the country. And our effort, the president's effort to continue that fight doesn't stop tomorrow at all. This will be a fight of his presidency.
Senate Republicans are expected to block a sweeping bill to protect voting rights today. But Democrats are vowing the fight to pass the For the People Act is just beginning. We'll speak to Ari Berman of Mother Jones. Then we look at the climate crisis and the debate over infrastructure spending with Professor Leah Stokes of the University of California.
It's not hard to see the climate crisis on our doorstep, whether it's the drought or these record heat waves or the fires that are happening way outside of the wildfire season. It's clear that the climate crisis is happening now. And that's why we need Congress to act this summer and pass the American Jobs Plan so that we can actually take on the climate crisis at the scale that's necessary.
Plus, striking coal miners from Alabama have come here to New York to protest on Wall Street. The miners have been on strike since April.
I don't think the company ever thought we'd go on strike. I think they believed that we was just going to roll over and take whatever they offered. But we're going to show them. We'll be here one day longer, one day stronger.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The World Health Organization said Monday it's setting up a hub in South Africa to help poor and middle-income countries produce their own COVID-19 vaccines using the mRNA technology behind the world's most effective shots. The WHO said its plan could see new vaccine production begin in South Africa in as little as 9 to 12 months. The UN agency called on Moderna and Pfizer-BioNTech to share the technology to make the plan successful. This came as South African President Cyril Ramaphosa blasted wealthy nations and pharmaceutical companies that have refused to transfer life-saving technology to the Global South. On Monday, Ramaphosa repeated his call for a 3-year waiver on intellectual property rights for COVID-19 vaccines.
We are facing an emergency that is affecting the entire world, and it is wholly unfair and wholly unjust that pharmaceutical companies, as well as certain countries, are refusing to allow this provision to be waived so that there can be mass production of these vaccines so that we can save lives.
Ramaphosa's remarks came as COVID-19 cases and deaths across the African continent surged by more than 40% over the past week. Meanwhile, Cuba's health ministry says its 3-shot Abdala vaccine showed over 92% efficacy against COVID-19 in a late-stage clinical trial. The announcement came days after promising initial results from another Cuban vaccine, the Soberano dose. Health officials in Indonesia are tightening public health measures as the world's 4th most populous nation recorded a record number of COVID-19 cases Monday. Authorities are blaming the fast-spreading Delta coronavirus variant, though the explosion of new cases follows a surge of travel at the end of the month of Ramadan, when many Indonesians ignored travel restrictions to visit their hometowns. In Colombia, COVID-19 deaths have passed the 100,000 mark amidst a devastating 3rd wave of cases. This is Colombian epidemiologist Andrea Ramirez.
Certainly, this is the worst moment of the pandemic. From the perspective of positive cases, we are seeing 40% positivity, 4 out of 10 people infected. Also, the collapse of the ICUs. It is the first time that Bogota has had such a prolonged hospital collapse, and we have had this alarming figure for several days now.
The Biden administration admitted Monday it's fallen behind on its own goal of sending 80 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine abroad by the end of June. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said it was a matter of distribution, not supply.
We have plenty of doses to share with the world, but this is a Herculean logistical challenge, and we've seen that as we've begun to implement.
A new report finds deaths among Medicare patients in U.S. nursing homes surged by 32% last year. The Inspector General of the Department of Health and Human Services found 4 in 10 Medicare recipients in nursing homes tested positive for COVID-19 in 2020 or had symptoms consistent with the disease. Meanwhile, new cases continue to fall in most parts of the United States, but are on the rise in some areas with low vaccination rates. In Florida, 6 people contracted COVID-19 in an outbreak at a government building in Manatee County, 5 of whom were hospitalized. 2 have died. The only employee who was exposed who did not become infected had been vaccinated. Senate Republicans are expected to use the filibuster today to block the For the People Act, a sweeping bill that would restore protections of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has scheduled the first procedural vote on the legislation today, even though Democrats do not have the votes to move it forward. That's because 2 Democratic senators, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, oppose eliminating the filibuster. We'll have more on this story after headlines with Ari Berman of Mother Jones. The United States, European Union, United Kingdom and Canada have imposed new sanctions on Belarus after its military diverted a Ryanair passenger jet to Minsk in May in order to arrest a journalist on board. The new sanctions came as UN Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet said the government of President Alexander Lukashenko was guilty of torture and other abuses.
The situation in Belarus also continues to deteriorate, with severe restrictions on civic space, including the rights to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association, raids against civil society and independent media, and the judicial persecution of human rights activists and journalists. We continue to receive numerous allegations of arbitrary arrests and detentions, torture and ill treatment.
In more international news, a group of indigenous leaders and members of Mexico's Zapatista movement have arrived in Spain to mark 500 years of indigenous resistance after Spanish colonizers settled in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, which later became Mexico City. The Zapatistas sailed across the Atlantic Ocean for over a month after departing Mexico in early May. Their boat depicted a big white sign with the phrase, "Wake up," written in red letters in Spanish. During their trip, the indigenous leaders plan to tour Europe and share their plans to fight the inequities triggered by capitalism. Back in the United States, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is seeking to prohibit President Biden and other Catholic politicians from receiving communion over their support for reproductive and abortion rights. The bishops' move came despite advice from the Vatican not to push for such measures. President Biden is the 2nd Roman Catholic president after John F. Kennedy. In California, Governor Gavin Newsom is set to announce his state will pay off all the past due rent that accumulated during the pandemic. California will use its unexpected budget surplus and federal stimulus money to finance the $5.2 billion program. However, it's still unclear whether California will ban evictions of people with unpaid rent past June 30th. Across the United States, over 11 million people are behind on their rent and could face eviction from their homes when the federal eviction moratorium expires at the end of the month. In Texas, a new report on the impacts of the pandemic inside prisons reveals at least 18 people who had been cleared for parole last year died of COVID-19, and some 24 others died of chronic health issues before their scheduled release. That follows at least 26 Texas prisoners who died in 2019 after they were approved for parole. The report, published by the University of Texas at Austin, highlights a pattern of delaying the release of incarcerated people who've been paroled for as much as 1 year. In related news, the Marshall Project reports some 31,000 federal prisoners have sought compassionate release since the start of the pandemic. The Bureau of Prisons approved just 36 of those appeals. A new lawsuit filed in a Washington, D.C. court alleges meat giant Smithfield lied to the U.S. public throughout the pandemic in order to protect corporate profits. Food and Water Watch, which brought the suit, says in a statement, quote, Smithfield utterly failed to protect its workers as the coronavirus spread like wildfire throughout its meat processing facilities, and its fear-mongering about meat shortages was designed to exploit consumer panic and boost sales, they said. More than 58,000 U.S. meatpacking and slaughterhouse workers have contracted COVID-19, and 293 have died. In Illinois, cleanup is continuing from a massive tornado that swept through the suburbs west of Chicago late Sunday night, damaging over 100 homes and injuring several people, including a woman left in critical condition. A storm came as a record-breaking late spring heat wave exacerbated a devastating drought in the western United States. The extreme weather fueled wildfires in Arizona, California, Colorado, and Oregon. In Northern California, smoke from the Willow Fire in Monterey County continues to bring hazy skies and poor air quality to the San Francisco Bay Area. 7 million people in 6 states were under red flag warnings, with meteorologists forecasting another heat wave next week. Climate youth activists and members of the Sunrise Movement ended their 400-mile march from New Orleans to Texas Monday outside the Houston home of Republican Senator Ted Cruz, a committed climate change denier. At least 8 protesters were arrested. 19-year-old climate activist Ishan Gupta said in a statement, quote, "Biden, I voted for you because I thought I was securing my future, but every day since inauguration, I've woken up with the same fears. Deliver on your promises so I can have a future doing meaningful work like fixing our power grid," he said. In February, millions of Texas residents faced a massive blackout and freezing temperatures after the state's power grid collapsed. At the time, Senator Cruz decided to travel to Cancun, Mexico, to escape the winter cold. It's primary day in New York State. New York City is the largest jurisdiction in the country to use ranked choice voting, with the most watched mayoral primary in decades. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled unanimously Monday that the National Collegiate Athletic Association, the NCAA, could not prohibit colleges from providing education-related pay and other benefits to college players. Justices rejected the NCAA's argument that payments were a threat to the amateur status of student-athletes, ruling the association is not exempt from U.S. antitrust laws. The landmark ruling paves the way for a broader challenge of the NCAA's ban on other forms of compensation, such as direct payments for athletic accomplishments. College athletics is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and athletes argue they should be compensated for their labor. And Las Vegas Raiders defensive lineman Carl Nassib has become the first active NFL player to come out as gay. Nassib made the announcement Monday in a social media post.
I just want to take a quick moment to say that I'm gay. I've been meaning to do this for a while now, but I finally feel comfortable enough to get it off my chest. I really have the best life. I got the best family, friends, and job a guy could ask for. I'm a pretty private person, so I hope you guys know that I'm really not doing this for attention. I just think that representation and visibility are so important. I actually hope that one day videos like this and the whole coming out process are just not necessary. But until then, I'm going to do my best and do my part to cultivate a culture that's accepting, that's compassionate, and I'm going to start by donating $100,000 to the Trevor Project. They're an incredible organization. They're the #1 suicide prevention service for LGBTQ youth in America, and they're truly doing incredible things.
Openly gay athletes are largely absent from major U.S. professional sports, with only a handful of active players in the NBA, NHL, Major League Baseball, or the NFL ever coming out during their careers. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, we begin today's show looking at the fight over voting rights. Senate Republicans are expected to use the filibuster today to block the For the People Act, a sweeping bill that would restore protections of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer scheduled the first procedural vote on the legislation today, even though Democrats do not have the votes to move it forward. That's because 2 Democratic senators, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, oppose eliminating the filibuster. Last week, Manchin offered a watered-down voting bill, but that too faced opposition from Republicans. The Senate vote comes as Republican state lawmakers are passing sweeping measures to suppress the vote around the country. According to the Voting Rights Lab, 18 states have enacted more than 30 laws to restrict voting since the November election. On Monday, Senate Majority Leader Schumer accused Republicans of backing voter suppression.
Let's dispense with this nonsense. There is no real principle behind these policies. They're not about election integrity. They're not about voter fraud. These policies have one purpose and one purpose only: making it harder for younger, poorer, non-white, and typically Democratic voters to access the ballot.
While today's Senate vote on the For the People Act is expected to fail, voting rights advocates say the fight has just begun. More than 70 groups have backed a national campaign called Deadline for Democracy to push senators to protect voting rights during the upcoming Senate recess. We're joined now by Ari Berman, reporter for Mother Jones. His new cover story for the magazine headlined, "Jim Crow Killed Voting Rights for Generations. Now the GOP is repeating history." He is author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Ari. Why don't you start off?
Hi, Amy. Good to see you again.
It's great to have you with us. Start off by explaining what the For the People Act is and exactly what is happening today.
The For the People Act is the most important voting rights bill since the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It would expand voting access for millions of Americans through policies like automatic and election day registration, 2 weeks of early voting, no excuse absentee voting, restoring voting rights to people with past felony convictions, preventing discriminatory voter ID laws and voter purging, public financing of elections, a ban on partisan gerrymandering, all of that for federal elections. So it would set really expansive rules for federal elections in all 50 states. So you have the same right to vote if you live in Oregon compared to if you live in Texas. And what's happening is that Republicans are going to block a vote on whether to even debate this bill. The vote today in the Senate is not a vote on the For the People Act. It's a vote to even debate the For the People Act. And so it just goes to show you how afraid the Republican Party is of democracy, that they won't even debate legislation to make it easier to vote, let alone vote on the actual bill.
So, Ari, given the fact that Republicans have signaled that they're going to do everything possible to kill the bill, why do you feel what's the sense of why the Democrats have decided to press for a vote?
Well, they want to show how obstructionist Republicans are being. And Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is building a case here that Republicans have now blocked the January 6th Commission, which had strong bipartisan support. They have blocked votes on paycheck fairness. They are blocking votes on gun control, on climate change, and a whole host of other popular issues. And they are blocking a vote on the most fundamental right in democracy, the right to vote. And so he wants to lay out a case of all of the Republican obstruction to convince Democrats that they need to either abolish or pare down the filibuster in order to pass these critical bills. Now, I don't know if they're going to succeed in doing that. Joe Manchin, Kyrsten Sinema, some other Democrats have been very steadfast. They will not weaken or get rid of the filibuster. Nonetheless, Schumer is hoping that Republican obstruction will give them no other choice.
And you mentioned Manchin. He was backing another voting rights act, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. Could you talk about the differences between the two and what's happened with even the one that Manchin was backing?
The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would restore a key part of the Voting Rights Act that was gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013 that requires states with a long history of discrimination like Georgia and Texas to once again have to approve their voting changes with the federal government. Now, what the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act does is it blocks new voter suppression efforts in states with a history of discrimination, both in the past and present. But it would not block voter suppression laws that are already on the books, nor would it put in place policies to make it easier to vote nationwide. That's what the For the People Act does. And so these bills are really meant to work together. The For the People Act is meant to expand voting access all across the board, and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act is supposed to stop voter suppression in the places where voter suppression has historically been most prevalent. It's not an either-or thing. That's what Manchin has said, that he wants one bill, not the other, although now he's backing a revised For the People Act. But these bills really were viewed by voting rights advocates as two bills that were supposed to work together so that there would be expansive federal legislation protecting the right to vote.
And if you can explain, in what Manchin has proposed, Stacey Abrams, the leading voting rights activist in the country from Georgia, has come out and endorsed, saying this would be acceptable. McConnell says he wouldn't accept it, and accepted his idea of voter ID, though that voter ID could be any number of kinds of ID. Is that right, Ari? Can you explain this, the significance of Abrams endorsing Manchin's revision of the bill?
Yeah, I think most Democrats would rather see something passed rather than nothing when it comes to protecting voting rights. And Manchin's proposal is a mixed bag, but it has a lot of policies that voting rights advocates support. Manchin wants Election Day to be a national holiday. He wants a ban on partisan gerrymandering. He wants automatic voter registration. He wants 2 weeks of early voting. He wants more disclosure of dark money. Those are all things that voting rights advocates strongly support. Now, there are some things that they're not so crazy about. Manchin supports a less restrictive version of voter ID. It's not the same voter ID laws that have been implemented in places like Texas, but it basically says if you don't have photo ID, you can still vote with things like utility bills. So that's not quite as bad as strict ID. He would still allow some version of voter purging. So there are things in there that are good in Manchin's proposal. There are things in there that are bad. But the point is, no Republicans have come out to support his proposal. So the question is, why are Democrats compromising over voting rights when Republicans won't even support that compromise to begin with? Why not introduce and pass legislation to actually solve the problem if Republicans aren't going to support it to begin with? Use the power you have, because the other side's not going to accommodate you regardless.
Ari, you recently reported about how dark money groups are writing Republican voter suppression bills across the country. Your piece featured leaked video of Jessica Anderson, the executive director of Heritage Action for America, a former Trump administration staffer, speaking at a gathering in Tucson, Arizona in April.
Iowa was the first state that we got to work in, and we did it quickly and we did it quietly. Honestly, nobody noticed. At the end of the day, the bill that Governor Kemp signed and the Georgia legislature marshaled through had 8 key provisions that Heritage recommended. We're working with these state legislators to make sure they have all of the information they need to draft the bills. In some cases, we actually draft them for them, or we have a sentinel on our behalf give them the model legislation, so it has that grassroots, from the bottom up type of vibe.
Okay, so that's leaked video of Jessica Anderson, the executive director of Heritage Action for America, a former Trump administration staffer. Explain the significance of what she's saying.
This was a really explosive video that Mother Jones published in conjunction with the watchdog group Documented, who obtained the video, showing that Heritage Action, the sister group of the Heritage Foundation, one of the largest right-wing think tanks, was actually writing model legislation for the states to make it harder to vote. They brag in the video that they wrote 19 provisions of a Texas bill, 8 provisions of a Georgia bill, 3 provisions of an Iowa bill. So you have a dark money group, we don't know its donors, raising millions of dollars from secret billionaire donors who are writing legislation, making it harder to vote all across the country. And Republicans have portrayed this legislation as organic, bottom-up legislation responding to the worries of their constituents, when in fact, you have dark money groups in Washington that are exporting a voter suppression agenda to the states. And that's the exact thing that the For the People Act would stop. The connection between dark money and voter suppression is exactly what the For the People Act targets. And what Heritage is doing is they are spending $24 million to make it harder to vote in 8 battleground states, and they are trying to block H.R. 1, which they say will destroy our democracy. And they're specifically targeting people like Joe Manchin to get them to oppose H.R. 1 and to keep the filibuster to prevent voting rights legislation from passing.
Well, Ari, you mentioned the $24 million that are being raised for suppression. There was a report in the New York Times today that a Democratic-leaning PAC of Priorities USA is putting up $20 million for voter education and registration before the upcoming midterm elections. Could you talk about this whole battle over voter suppression in a historical context, its relationship to past efforts to suppress the vote in American history?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of echoes about the voter suppression that's happening right now and the voter suppression that happened in the past. That's what my Mother Jones cover story about Jim Crow was about. The pattern that existed during the Jim Crow era and during Reconstruction was that you had new voters turn out. Black voters were enfranchised. That was followed by violence, fraud, intimidation to try to prevent blacks from voting. Then that was followed by attempts to change the laws to prevent blacks from voting altogether when states like Mississippi rushed to change their constitutions. And the same pattern is playing out today, which you had much higher turnout in 2020. You had new people turn out. That was followed by an attempt to try to overturn the election. Then that was followed by states rewriting their laws to achieve the same outcomes as the insurrection. And one of the key parallels between the Jim Crow era and today was that Congress had an opportunity to protect voting rights. They passed a bill in 1890 to protect voting rights. It passed the House. It was killed by a filibuster in the Senate. And that's why disenfranchisement laws were allowed to go forward in places like Mississippi and Georgia and Alabama and all across the Jim Crow South. And the same kind of pattern is playing out today, which is that Republicans are rushing to disenfranchise voters. The House has passed legislation to stop it, but it's going to be killed by a Senate filibuster. If that happens, Republicans are going to be able to undermine voting rights in the states for decades, and Democrats are going to be virtually powerless to be able to stop it.
Finally, I want to ask you about Georgia and Arizona. Arizona is finishing up, they say, this week, their what some call their fraudit, the audit of so-called voter fraud. And many are concerned that's going to be used as a model around the country, including Georgia. At the same time, you have Georgia's Republican Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, saying he's removed over 100,000 names from the state voter rolls, saying most of them were linked to change of address or from residences where election mail had been returned to sender. And you have the Georgia Governor Brian Kemp saying there's nothing Jim Crow about the recent voter suppression law passed in Georgia. Put all of that together.
Well, what Republicans are doing is they are weaponizing the big lie on every front. They're keeping alive the lie that the election was stolen through these bogus audits. They're making it harder to vote in so many different ways. The Georgia law that Brian Kemp says has nothing to do with Jim Crow has 16 different provisions making it harder for Democratic constituencies and communities of color to be able to vote, which is why Stacey Abrams calls it Jim Crow in a suit and tie. They're actually making it easier to overturn election results. They're purging local election officials. They're taking over county election boards. They're taking over state election boards. In 14 different states, they are politicizing election administration in an unprecedented way. So it's a flood the zone strategy when it comes to voter suppression. It's not one tactic. It's not another tactic. It's all of these different tactics to make it harder to vote. And that's why federal legislation is so important, because if the Congress doesn't step in to block these voter suppression efforts, these attempts to overturn elections, Republicans are just going to be emboldened, and they're going to go further and further and further. And the crazy things we're seeing in Arizona, the crazy things we're seeing in Georgia, these are going to become the new normal if Congress doesn't act.
Ari Berman, thanks so much for being with us. Reporter for Mother Jones, author of Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. We will link to your piece, Jim Crow Killed Voting Rights for Generations. Now the GOP is repeating history. Next up, we look at the climate crisis and the debate over infrastructure spending. Stay with us.
Falling and it's falling. children lead the way. 'Cause I love you, I won't leave you, won't let you slip away. Come what may, we're gonna find a way. The South gotta change. The South gotta change. You told a life you're so longer a stranger to yourself. You're all dressed up and
South Gotta Change by Adia Victoria. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. President Joe Biden's planning to meet with lawmakers in a push to reach a bipartisan agreement on a new infrastructure plan. The group of 10 Republican and Democratic senators recently proposed a $1.2 trillion infrastructure package, but many Democrats have criticized the deal for not doing enough to address the climate crisis, among other issues. Meanwhile, some Democrats are considering a $6 trillion package that could be passed through the reconciliation process if all 50 Democrats agree to vote for it. The debate over infrastructure and combating the climate emergency comes as Western states are facing daily reminders of the crisis, including drought, water shortages, and extreme heat. Many cities have already broken all-time heat records, even though it's still June. Last week, Phoenix recorded 5 days in a row of temperatures over 115 degrees Fahrenheit for the first time ever. Santa Fe, New Mexico tied its all-time high of 102 degrees Fahrenheit. Forecasters are predicting it could hit 110 degrees next week in Portland, Oregon. About 26% of the West is experiencing exceptional drought. Water levels at Lake Mead have dropped to their lowest levels ever recorded. We're joined right now by Leah Stokes. She's an assistant professor of political science at University of California, Santa Barbara, researcher on climate and energy policy. She's the author of Short-Circuiting Policy, Interest Groups and the Battle Over Clean Energy and Climate Policy in the American States. Welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Professor Stokes. So talk about the desperate situation, the drought in the West, and how that links very practically to this debate over infrastructure spending.
Well, I think you talked about it at the top of the segment here. You know, the reality is it's not just the West that's in a debate. It's really about half of the entire country that is facing really a historic drought. Scientists are saying that in some parts of the West, they're seeing a drought that's worse than we've seen in, something like 4 centuries. So the fact is that the climate crisis is here now. The drought, the heat waves that you talked about, setting record temperatures all across the western United States and really even reaching into parts of the Midwest. These are the signatures of climate change. And the fact is that the climate crisis is on our doorstep. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to continue to talk about having Infrastructure Day or Infrastructure Week for another 4 years? Or are we actually going to see Congress act and pass a bold climate package this summer?
Well, Professor, you've said that the Biden administration and the Senate and House Democrats are committed to true climate action. But how do you see this playing out, given the clear Republican resistance? What do you think is doable, and of the stuff that's not doable, what kind of public pressure needs to come on Washington to get it done?
Well, I think you're right that we need to keep the public pressure up. I noticed at the top of the hour you talked about sunrises marches, which have been happening in both California and across the Gulf Coast. There have been lots of actions, whether that's against Line 3 or for these kinds of infrastructure negotiations that have been trying to raise awareness of lawmakers of just how urgent the climate crisis is. And we really need to keep that up. And the good news is that just a week or two ago, a group of senators, we have over 12 senators at this point now, have said in the line of Senator Markey, no climate, no deal. Meaning that if there is not climate change in the package that moves forward this summer, they're not going to move a package forward this summer. And I think that's really shaken free the negotiations in Congress, because what we're now seeing is that Majority Leader Schumer is saying, okay, we can have a 2-track process. We can continue along with this bipartisan idea that's been going on for several months now, and we can finally start the budget reconciliation process for the broader infrastructure package that Senator Senator Sanders is helping to lead. So I think that we're starting to see this two-track process develop. But the fundamental thing that's part of this process is no climate, no deal. We have to have a bold climate package that's happening through the budget reconciliation process past this summer.
Well, the president has already sharply reduced his initial proposal on infrastructure. What's in the bipartisan policy package now, and what's been excluded so far?
Well, we don't actually know a lot of what is in the bipartisan policy package. There was a two-pager that came out a couple days ago, and it said that there would be about $600 billion in new spending. So things like overwhelmingly roads and bridges and sort of that kind of infrastructure. There was some more hopeful things, though, because previous Republican proposals have included, for example, $0 for the power grid, while this proposal included about $73 billion for the power grid. There's also significant investments in public transit. So, there are decent ideas in this bipartisan approach, but it is not a substitute for a climate bill at the scale that's necessary. And there's also been questions raised about some of the pay-fors for this Republican bill. For example, they've been talking about putting taxes on electric vehicles, the exact opposite thing one should be doing right now. And Senator Sanders in particular has said that he's not interested in a proposal that does that, nor is President Biden, who campaigned on saying that he would not raise taxes for anybody making $400,000 or less. So the pay-fors in the bipartisan approach are really lacking right now. They include things like repurposing COVID funds, which probably need to be spent on COVID. So I think we need a little bit more details. And it's clear that this bipartisan group is trying to work to figure out exactly what their plan is to pay for this new spending.
Can you talk more about the climate crisis in the West? I mean, we live in information silos that are determined in all different ways, including geographically. And for people to understand the significance of what's happening throughout Arizona, California, and beyond.
Absolutely. I've only lived in California since 2015, and the droughts and fires and heat waves that I have experienced in that short time are really unprecedented. I lived through the Thomas Fire, which was then the largest fire in modern California history. And there's been information going around lately that that's actually now the 7th largest fire, and that only took place in 2017. So a lot of people in the Western United States are just experiencing year after year of extreme heat waves, extreme drought, extreme fires that we've really never seen before. This is why scientists are beginning to talk about things like mega droughts and mega fires and mega heat waves, these huge scale events that don't just span, the Western United States, but go all the way to the Midwest, with record temperatures happening in June, and then another record event likely to happen next week. It's only June. Normally, these kinds of extreme heat waves come in August. And we know from climate scientists that this is climate change, that, heat waves are more than twice as likely to be happening because of climate change. And that's from science that's a few years old. I'm sure if scientists are looking at what we're seeing right now, they're even more alarmed. So the climate crisis is really happening right now. And every single year we delay on passing a climate bill, the worse the crisis gets. Folks may remember that over a decade ago, we tried to pass a climate bill, the Waxman-Markey bill. It failed in the Senate. And we have already had the president propose this American Jobs Plan at the end of March. And we have been waiting for almost 3 months to see Congress act. And while we wait, we see climate change happening all across the United States.
Professor Stokes, I wanted to ask you about the state roles in addressing the climate crisis. We're seeing reports all around the country now that state governments have more cash and more surplus than they've ever had in their histories as a result of rebounding tax revenues and also federal assistance. California, New York, New Jersey, all these states have more money to spend this year than they've ever had before. And I'm wondering what your sense is of what states could be doing to direct some of those funds, since this is basically a one-shot situation for this year and perhaps next year in terms of being able to address climate change at the state level.
That's a great question. You know, the great thing about acting on climate change is that it is an investment. When we're talking about infrastructure, when we're talking about one-time spending, it's actually spending that pays itself back, both through the infrastructure itself as well as through job creation, all kinds of things throughout the economy. So I think that you're right that governors should be looking at spending money on climate change, building, for example, clean energy, helping to build more public transit and support that infrastructure. Because if you put the money in at time one, it can actually pay you back over many years. So I do think that the states have an important role to play, but the federal government really has the power of the purse. And we're not talking about sort of a one-time surplus. We're talking about spending trillions of dollars on the climate crisis. And that is really just a down payment on the scale of the crisis. So I think that we can't sort of look away from the federal government. We have to see them act alongside states.
Can you finally talk about the report that you just co-authored with the Sierra Club, Professor Stokes, called The Dirty Truth About Utility Climate Pledges, looking at greenwashing by utility companies?
Absolutely. So several months ago, I worked with the Sierra Club to research what are utilities planning to do. And they put out a lot of corporate pledges saying that they want to decarbonize by, let's say, 2050. But we compared those pledges to their actual investment behavior, to their proposals that they make about what they'd like to build. And the fact is, across this country, we have about 230 fossil gas plants currently proposed. If those plants were built, it would be absolutely devastating for the climate crisis. And so on the one hand, we have utilities saying, yes, we want to clean up, we want to address climate change. But on the other hand, we have them proposing massive amounts of fossil infrastructure. And so how do we reconcile these two things? Well, we have to recognize that if we really want to clean up our infrastructure, we need to have federal legislation, specifically a federal clean electricity standard. President Biden campaigned and won on a plan for 100% clean power by 2035. And it's clear that there's a lot of support from some utilities as well as within Congress to pass a clean electricity standard that would target 80% clean power by 2030. And I wrote another report with Evergreen Action and Data for Progress, which looked at how exactly we can do that as part of the budget reconciliation process. So if we really want to get on top of the climate crisis, the power sector is the most important place to start. Because if we have clean electricity, like 80% clean power by 2030 because of this clean electricity standard, and we combine that with electrification, things like electric vehicles, electric stoves, and heat pumps, we can actually decarbonize about 75% of our economy. And when we talk about President Biden's goal of cutting emissions by 50% by 2030, if we had that clean electricity standard and we passed that through Congress, we got to 80% clean by 2030. The fact is we'd be more than halfway to meeting the president's goal of cutting emissions by 50% by 2030. So really, there's no substitute for laws, unfortunately. It's one thing for utilities to say they'd like to do things, but we actually need legislation to make sure they do things. And that legislation at the federal level can actually be an investment to help them do things and to help them get on track with the pledges that they claim that they want to fulfill.
Leah Stokes, we want to thank you so much for being with us, Assistant Professor of Political Science at University of California, Santa Barbara, researcher on climate and energy policy, author of Short-Circuiting Policy, also co-host of the podcast A Matter of Degrees. She's also on the advisory board at Evergreen Action. Next up, striking coal miners from Alabama are here in New York to protest on Wall Street. The miners have been on strike since April. Stay with us.
You old black gold, you've taken my lungs, and your dust has darkened my home. And now that road you're used to log my block, and it's big leather wood, and now it's blue diamond too. The pits, they're closing, get another job, but what else can an old miner do? In the mines, in the mines, in the blue diamond mines, I worked my poor life away.
Blue Diamond Mines, the Johnson Mountain Boys. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. More than 1,000 coal miners are now in the third month of their strike in the so-called right-to-work state of Alabama. The struggle is attracting national attention not long after workers in Bessemer, Alabama, tried to organize a union at their Amazon warehouse. About 30 miles from Bessemer, miners at Warrior Met Coal in Brookwood walked off the job April 1st after their union, United Mine Workers of America, called the first strike to hit the state's coal mining industry in 4 decades. Workers are fighting for improvements to wages and benefits after they agreed to drastic cutbacks in 2016 when Warrior Met Coal took control of the mines after the previous company went bankrupt. This is part of a report by independent labor journalist Kim Kelly about the demands of the miners and their union. This was done for the Real News Network.
One of their key demands concerned their health care plans. Under a prior contract, when the mines were still controlled by Jim Walter Resources, the company had covered 100% of the miners' medical costs. But after they went bankrupt in 2015 and Warrior Met bought the mines, that changed.
They threatened to take away all the retirees' pensions and retirement. And they kind of forced the guys into taking a contract, basically saying, if you don't accept this, then you're going to lose everything. We'll just close. So they took a huge cut in pay, and they cut their insurance and their benefits. Used to, we had almost 100% coverage for insurance. And now it's thousands of dollars even to meet your deductible.
That last voice was Hayden Wright, president of the local chapter of the United Mine Workers of America. Last month, nearly a dozen miners were arrested trying to shut down the mine and stop non-unionized workers from getting in and out. Kim Kelly documented the standoff in this report for More Perfect Union.
Miners at the Warrior Met Coal in Tuscaloosa County have been on strike. The union and the company still trying to agree on a contract.
The union says the miners helped get the company out of bankruptcy over the past 5 years, but have never received fair compensation for their efforts.
You took cutting pay, you took cutting your days, cutting safety, health and safety, cutting your benefits. Now the company is getting back on their feet, making all kinds of money, and they don't want to share that same progress with us.
Warrior Met Coal ain't got no soul!
Feel like we're breaking the law when this company is trying to starve our people and their families from their livelihood.
I'll die for my family, and I'll do whatever it takes for this union right here.
This is personal. It's personal.
This comes as the United Mine Workers of America has documented at least 3 separate incidents of cars driving into the workers on the picket lines during their strike. Today, a group of striking mine workers have traveled from Alabama to New York to protest the Wall Street hedge funds backing Warrior Met, including BlackRock Fund Advisors, SSGA Funds Management, and Renaissance Technologies. For more, we're joined by Kim Kelly. She's an independent labor journalist and organizer. Her series for The Real News is titled Battleground Brookwood. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Kim. It's great to have you with us. So why don't you give us further background on this strike and exactly what the miner workers are doing in New York today?
For sure. So these miners have been on strike since April 1st on unfair labor practices strike. They have been out for almost 3 months now. On April 8th, the local union leadership and the company, they came together with a tentative agreement that they presented to the membership. And the membership overwhelmingly voted that down and voted to stay out on strike. And now they've been out there on the picket lines every single day ever since. They haven't gotten very much outside media attention. They've gotten a lot of local support and support from within the labor movement. And today, a group of the miners and UMWA officials, as well as some international labor leaders, Sarah Nelson from AFA and Stuart Applebaum from RWDSU, are out here protesting, picketing in front of these venture capital investors' offices, because these are the companies that fund Warrior Met and allow Warrior Met to pay their executives millions of dollars a year, while the miners, the workers themselves who are creating that value, are struggling to get by on sometimes as little as $22 an hour to spend 6 days a week, 12 hours a day underground in one of the deepest mines in North America, which also happens to be filled with methane gas.
And Kim Kelly, could you talk a little bit more about Warrior Met and what it's been able to take out in revenue and profits since it took over the mine?
Right. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but they have done very well for themselves. Their latest quarterly report, they did have a loss in this past quarter because of the pandemic and various factors within the industry. But they have made their money back. They are very robust. They're doing fine. And one of the key issues with this strike is that, back in 2016, when the miners signed on that dotted line and agreed to take this subpar contract, it was with the understanding that once this new company got on its feet and made its profits, that when it came time for the new contract, then the miners would see their fair share of those profits. And now that obviously has not happened. And that's one of the primary factors here, is that this company that has investors based on Wall Street, who is sending all of its product overseas and is exploiting the labor of these folks in rural Alabama, they are not coming to the bargaining table with anything meaningful. They are not bargaining in good faith. And as you mentioned earlier on in the report, there is actual, active hostility and violence that is happening as a result of the company's hostile approach towards these workers.
And also, given the climate today in the United States with so much racial strife and racial division across the country, this strike is an example of interracial unity, isn't it? Could you talk about the workforce itself and its composition?
Yes, so the UMWA has been established in the state of Alabama since 1890, and throughout its tenure there, it has been one of historically the most interracial, racially integrated locals in the country. The UMWA as a whole, actually going back to its founding, has been much more integrated than some of the other major unions in this country. And in Brookwood and in the Warrior Met mines, I think the workforce is about 20% Black. And obviously there are women, there are multiple genders involved. It's not just a bunch of white guys in hard hats, which is sort of the general media image of coal miners. But that's not who they are. That's not what they look like. And these folks are working together. And the fact that this is happening just a few miles outside of Bessemer, where we saw this other incredible organizing campaign, I think is very significant, because that part of Alabama, the labor movement, has very deep roots, and it intertwines very closely with the civil rights movement and the struggle for Black liberation. So this is a much bigger story than just a few people that are upset about a contract. There's a lot of history here, too.
I want to turn to a clip of Shane Olmstead, a striking mine worker in Alabama.
They had done cut our pay, cut our insurance, cut all the things out, and then they made millions, over the next 5 years, because the coal market went from $86 a ton when we was asked to take pay cuts to $230, $240 a ton. And now they don't want to give anything back to their workers.
That was Shane Olmstead, a striking mine worker in Alabama. This is James Blankenship, a mine worker union representative, explaining the lingering effects of black lung.
I had an uncle that died from black lung. He could not literally chew a bite of food without having to stop and take oxygen. That's how bad his lungs were.
So if you could, Kim Kelly, talk about these people that you interviewed, this issue of black lung, and then how can supporters of the coal workers supporting the fight for better wages, for better working conditions, also talk about a transition to a greener and overall safer economy, more sustainable for the world?
Right. So obviously a lot has changed since back in the day, you know, this sort of stereotypical image of the coal miner with their pickaxe and their little headlight going down in these tiny tunnels. But a lot of the same risks are still there. You know, these folks are dealing with massive machinery underground. There's ventilation issues. There's, you know, this age-old terror of black lung is actually on the rise again in this country. A lot of that has to do with the fact that some of the mines in West Virginia and Kentucky, they're not union. And so the safety regulations are, you know, there's no one keeping an eye on that. And the silica and quartz in that rock makes it much more difficult to, you know, get out of there without getting black lung. I think at this point, about 10% of veteran coal miners are dealing with this affliction. So it hasn't disappeared. There's still people struggling with this. And, you know, when I was down there, I met this young man named Dalton, who was 22 years old. A couple weeks into his, you know, just starting at Warrior Met, he was crushed underground by two massive pieces of machinery. And now he's paralyzed from the waist down. Like, these are the stories that I'm hearing. These are the horrible dangers and risks that people are dealing with just to go down there and to make their money and to take care of their families. It's a job that a lot of folks are very proud of and feel very deeply about. I've met third and fourth generation miners down there. But I also have found that people are cognizant of the fact that, you know, coal and fossil fuels in general are not exactly great for the environment. I don't think there's any illusions there. And I think that folks would like to see a greener, cleaner, healthier environment for everyone. But the thing that, you know, that speaks to these folks who are in these small rural coal mining communities is this fear that they'll be left behind. I think that was a big feature in the statement that recently came out from UMWA President Cecil Roberts. He was talking about how the union would be willing to support Biden's green energy initiatives as long as there's actually funding and training set aside to create good paying union jobs for these folks so that there is an actual transition and that they're not just being left to fend for themselves. I think, you know, and also there is this kind of this little wrinkle in this particular story, because even if we went to green energy, a fully green economy tomorrow, these folks would still be down there digging out this coal because they dig out metallurgical coal, which is used to make coke, which is used to make steel. And the vast majority, if not all, of their product that they create is sent overseas to industrializing nations who are hungry for coal. And so they're in kind of a different sector of all of this.
Yeah, Kim, we only have about 30 seconds left, but I just wanted to ask you the role of the police and the state troopers during this strike. I understand that the mines are isolated, the entrances, and they're not the traditional picket lines that are occurring.
Yes, they're isolated. There's 12 smaller groups that are kind of scattered around this massive area, and there's a police presence. The company has hired private armed security, and unfortunately, it doesn't seem like anybody is really that concerned with the safety of these miners, as we've seen with these particular attacks. So they really need all the help and support they can get from those outside of that situation, which people can do by donating to their strike fund and their strike pantry, which the Women's Auxiliary has been building up over the past couple months.
And finally, 10 seconds, what they're demanding of BlackRock today.
They want them to listen, to pay attention, and to see them. They want them to see the people that they're exploiting and come to the bargaining table with a decent contract, to do the right thing, and to treat them with respect.
Kim Kelly, independent labor journalist for More Perfect Union, Means TV, and The Real News, where her series is titled Battleground Brookwood. We'll link to it. That does it for our show. Democracy Now! Produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Bertina Guzder, Dermine Sheikh, Maria Taracena, Carla Wills, Tammy Warren. A special thanks to Julie Crosby. I'm Amy Goodman, Juan Gonzalez.